Okay. So why don't you tell us, in your words and in your understanding, the purpose of 504s, IEPs, what you see the differences as, and then I'm going to go into what a ShmIEP is. I am excited.
That sounds good. So, looking at IEPs and 504 plans, we get this question a lot. I think a lot of parents aren't sure what the difference is between the two, but they're both accommodation plans that can be given to our children. But there are some subtle and some overt differences. So, I'll start with let's start with the 504, for instance. Oftentimes, when we're doing parent sessions or a camp or professional sessions, 504 plans come up quite often. Most children with the diagnosis of selective mutism qualify for, at minimum, a 504 plan. And so a 504 plan, it sort of is a broader scale, less formal accommodation plan that a child can receive. So it really is part of the Civil Rights Act, and it prevents discrimination of students that have a disability. And I know whenever we bring up, this comes up a lot in camps
Oh,
and
yeah.
professional settings, that disability, that word, does my child have a disability? But under the Civil Rights Act, they qualify disability. There's a really broad spectrum of what falls under that definition. And so if a child has any barrier to learning or being in the school setting, and one of those barriers that we look at is the inability to speak. So that's one that qualifies children with SM to receive that 504 plan. Now, what gets covered under the 504 plan, that varies, but really it's meant to accommodate any barriers and remove barriers from learning. So, for instance, just to give a brief example, a child with SM, if they were, being penalized for having to do verbal presentations, an accommodation would be granted, that we don't want to say that this child is not able to speak at this time. They can't use their words in school at this time. Therefore, they can't do that presentation the way other children can. An accommodation would be put in place that would allow that child to have other means of doing that assignment without being penalized. So whether that's they can record it at home, they can do a written version and submit it. They can do it paired with partner if needed. So they put in different accommodations. The same way that if your child had the inability to walk, let's say they were in a wheelchair, the gym teacher couldn't say, well, you must run that 1 mile or you failed gym. An accommodation we put in place that allows that child, removes the barrier. That might be the running aspect, but gives them another meaningful way to accommodate the same action. So it's a broader view of disability, less formal, but it is under law. Under law, they have to accommodate the disability. A diagnosis needs to be provided for that disability to provide the 504. Now, the IEP is a little different. So the IEP then, it stands for an individualized education plan, and this is covered by special education law. And so a child needs to qualify for this. So typically when we're seeking out an individualized education plan, there is a diagnosis, and the diagnosis to qualify for an IEP is more specific. So often when we're doing our parent sessions at camp, we talk about who qualifies for what, and some parents will say, I attempted to qualify for an IEP and I didn't receive it. I was given a 504. Why? So state to state, we've seen that some states will qualify a child for an IEP under SM and some may not. There typically is a smaller subset of disabilities that are looked at under an IEP, so it's a little bit more specific, and you have to qualify to show that diagnosis, that disability, is actually impeding that child's ability to participate in the curriculum throughout the education process. So oftentimes individualized or specialized education is something with, let's say, the curriculum that our child needs a specific way. So think about children with a speech and language disorder. They receive speech services, and perhaps the way the curriculum is presented to them is done a little differently with support, because maybe they need more retelling of directions. They might need something explained and broken down into smaller steps. The same with a child with SM. If they qualify for an IEP because perhaps they have other diagnoses. Sometimes a child with SM, solely SM diagnosis receives a 504. But if a child has diagnoses such as selective mutism and sensory processing and a learning disorder and speech and language, or one or more of those, they often qualify for an IEP that says something about their education process and the curriculum needs to be specialized for their learning needs. And so it is a more specific qualifier. And through the testing that is done, the district then has to provide testing to make sure that we're looking at the child's strengths and also the areas that child has challenges, so that we can really provide the specialized instruction. The IEP typically falls under what we call the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And so there's a slight differences, but what I look at typically when I'm talking to families is most of our children with selective mutism, if there's other diagnoses, and we look at the sort of like the Ys of SM, and we talk about the Ys of SM, and when I say Ys, I mean WHYS. Why does this child have selective mutism, which we talk about in other podcasts? The IEP tends to cover more contributing factors, more diagnoses, and a 504 plan is a bit more simplified, that they're looking at a broader spectrum of disability. A child with SM has a barrier to learning. They want to put accommodations in place to remove those barriers, where IEP has more specialized instruction. We're addressing the curriculum in a very specific way for that child. That would be some of the difference.
Yeah, no, you summed it up really well. And, reading between the lines, it's, it sounds more difficult. Just understanding it is like a challenge. But the truth is, when all of our children who meet the criteria for having selective mutism, they meet that diagnosis, they have it. A social communication anxiety, as we know, they all should qualify at the minimum for a 504, because of the fact that speaking affects their ability to function, and that is they can't function the way others do. So those accommodations need to be in place. I will say that for preschool children, 3 to 5, before they start in kindergarten, you can qualify for an IEP in most preschools and so forth. And then the district would, if found eligible, and I want to quote unquote found eligible because, this is a big issue for us, is that they do provide services within the preschool setting. So this is why diagnosing early is really important too, because we can get these kids really functioning quickly. And that doesn't mean that parents listening to this who have teens should be discouraged, because we know teens can absolutely overcome this and reach their capacity. However, the earlier the diagnosis, the more these children are going to get, the help they need. In addition, an IEP is really through 12th grade. So it's through the public school system. If you're in a private school, you can get services through the public school on occasion. I have found it can be very difficult state to state. They will sometimes, the same child in one state would qualify for a 504, not an IEP, but they'll do similar types of services. So it can be very blurry at times. So I don't want people to get caught up in these terms. It's logistical, but the 504 goes through the lifespan. So we have a lot of college students, a lot of adults we work with. So even in the workplace, you can get in the college a 504 plan. So you can't get an IEP once they finish 12th grade, but the 504, absolutely. So we're constantly working with college students to get those accommodations in place to help them.